So they are behind the scenes managing everything. So I'm Jo Neal, Professor of Psychopharmacology at the University of Manchester. And I have to say, folks, it is not raining in Manchester today, contrary to popular belief, and it's not snowing. Amazing but true. And we had snow on Christmas Day. It was very nice. I'm also chair of Drug Science's Medical Psychedelics Working Group. Drug Science is the UK's leading independent organisation, providing evidence-based information about drugs, David Nutt's organisation. And also enabling patients to access medical cannabis through our Project 2021, without it costing much money. And this is our aim for the Medical Psychedelics Working Group when the time comes. So I would really encourage you, everybody, to join Drug Science as a community member, to listen to our podcasts. Loads of these have been on psychedelics, and I think we're up to 33 now. We've kept David Nutt very busy in lockdown. Today's event will be recorded and it will be hosted on James Morgan's YouTube channel. So that's the other thing, do access that, because all our other street drugs events are also on that. So you can, if you missed those, they've been fantastic. You can catch up with those. But today we're talking about psychedelic medicine, and this is a really hot topic, everybody, of course, isn't it? Such amazing healing power. So our focus is the application in two different settings, really. In a naturalistic setting, specifically ayahuasca in the Amazon in Peru, and psilocybin in a clinical setting at the Imperial Center for Psychedelic Research. I'm sure most of you know about this, but setting, location, therapy, and integration. And actually, I'm learning a little bit about the importance of the music in the sessions are really important aspects of the healing process for all this. So we are totally honored, folks, so excited today to have two world experts in this field who've been in it from the beginning, really. Certain aspects I'm particularly excited to hear about: the importance of indigenous cultures, shamanic rituals, how we make sure we fully respect this when we commercialize these plants as medicines in the West, the impact of the type of therapy provided in each setting. I know very little about that, and the medicines themselves. So ayahuasca and psilocybin, they're both plant medicines. They're both classical psychedelics, but they've very different effects. So you'll probably, if you've been before, you'll know our format is very relaxed and informal. And the whole point really is to get a discussion going. And that really is led by you guys, by asking your questions. Each speaker speaks for about 10 to 15 minutes on their particular topic, sort of by way of an introduction of their expertise. And then they'll both continue the discussions, as I said. What I'm going to do is introduce you to the first speaker, Simon Ruffle, give you a little bit of an intro to him. Then he'll speak for about 15 minutes. He's got slides for us. And then I'll introduce you to Ros Watts, our second speaker today. So Simon is a psychiatrist, an extremely busy psychiatrist. We were chatting earlier, he's completely rushed off his feet at the moment. You can imagine how busy it is in the NHS and how chaotic because of COVID and everything else that's going on. So we're really grateful to him for taking the time. He said he's doing this in his lunch break, folks. So we're really lucky to have him here. So he's at the Maudsley in London, and he's also based at King's College. He did his medical degree in Sheffield, and then he moved down south. So Simon's expertise is transcultural psychiatry, which is pretty special. He's worked in northern Uganda, and of course now his main focus is psychedelic medicine. His main interest is using ayahuasca in an adapted traditional setting in the Peruvian Amazon. Spent a lot of the last couple of years in the Amazon, and I'm pretty sure he wishes he was there right now. His significant expertise in the area of psychedelic medicine, particularly in a naturalistic setting. And he's currently, as well as practicing in the NHS, extremely busy completing his PhD at the moment on all this work. We both work with Heroic Hearts UK, a charity enabling combat veterans and first responders to access psychedelic medicine in naturalistic settings. So I'd just like to do a shout out to Heroic Hearts and to Keith Abraham, the CEO of Heroic Hearts, a combat veteran himself, who's used ayahuasca to treat his PTSD. Okay, so you'll be delighted to hear I'm going to stop talking now and hand you over to Simon, who's going to talk to you for about 10-15 minutes. Then I'll introduce Roz, and then I'll hand you over to Roz. Thank you very much, Simon.
Thanks, Jo. Can you see my slides? Yep, cool. Yep. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Today we'll be doing a quick overview into the research we've been doing over the last 5 years, looking into ayahuasca in an adapted traditional framework in the Peruvian Amazon. So that's retreat centers. And just a shout out to the rest of my team. There's Nige Netzband and Wai-Feng Sang as well. So first of all, we're going to talk about the first study that we did, which was looking at ayahuasca's effects on personality, before moving on to our most recent study looking at ayahuasca and childhood trauma and associated mental health outcomes. I'd just like to point out that we're still very much learning, and the real experts in this area are, of course, the indigenous people that we work with. So a little summary about ayahuasca. What is ayahuasca? This is actually a surprisingly complex question to answer, especially just with one slide. In very basic terms, ayahuasca is a plant brew, and it's psychedelic. It's a mix of the Amazonian vine Banisteriopsis caapi and the Psychotria viridis leaves. The leaves contain diphenylmethyltryptamine, DMT, which is a very potent psychedelic, and this is normally broken down in the stomach by enzymes, but the ayahuasca vine contains monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which, as well as being an old school antidepressant, actually prevent the DMT from being broken down in the stomach, and this allows us to absorb it into the bloodstream, and it exerts its psychedelic effects. This leads to profound changes in sensory perception. Many people purge, that can be through vomiting, or some people believe emotion. People quite often see visions, they have introspection, and some believe they can connect with the divine. Ayahuasca is used for a wide variety of purposes, for example, as a medicine, as a sacrament, as a tool for spiritual development, and more recently for adventure tourism as well. I don't think it's right to talk about the research that we do without shining a light on ayahuasca tourism, and it's not without its issues. Ayahuasca tourism, some people believe that this might be diluting the traditions, the indigenous traditions, because Westerners have an idea of what they want out of a retreat, and therefore some of the traditions are being tailored towards that. There are also environmental concerns, not just about people flying to the Amazon, but also the harvesting of ayahuasca and whether or not that's being done in a sustainable way. There are some safety concerns as well. In South America, ayahuasca, especially in Peru, is largely unregulated, and this has led to some charlatans trying to run retreats. Unfortunately, as well as psychological and physical problems, there's been an increase in sexual abuse as well. And Shakruna.net have actually released some guidelines advising people on how best to avoid that. And there's also an ethical code in how to run ayahuasca ceremonies. Some people believe that this might be a new way of neocolonialism because there's a market largely controlled by non-locals. That being said, ayahuasca tourism does lead to lots of healing, meaning, and a global community as well. Okay. So the research that we do is based in a Shipibo framework, and that's the tribe that we work with, and this has been adapted for ayahuasca tourists. We work with experienced practitioners such as Don Rono, who's the curandero, the shaman, and we can see him in this slide. And our research centre is based in the Mashana National Reserve in the Peruvian Amazon. This is a community of 80 indigenous people. There's no mains electricity, phone signal, or internet, and it's 2 to 3 hours away from the nearest town, which is Iquitos. Our research centre is called RIOSBO, and we're affiliated with MATS. So here's the location of the research center. We can see it's here in the center of the Amazon. And this is the Mashana community, where our research center is based. And this is actually Riospo, the research center. Okay. So a quick overview of our first study. So here we were looking at the effects of ayahuasca on personality structure. This was an observational repeated measures design. So we were testing participants immediately before and after their retreat, and then also 6 months later to look for long-term changes. The retreats lasted for 12 days and there were 6 ayahuasca ceremonies, 1 every other day. And we also conducted semi-structured interviews during the retreats. And this has been published in a separate publication. We had a sample group of 24 people, 9 of which were female. These were primarily from a Western background. 6 had tried psychedelics before. 6 hadn't tried psychedelics before. 10 had experience with psychedelics, and 8 had actually tried ayahuasca before. All of the participants were screened by the retreat center, which is called the Ayahuasca Foundation. 12 were found to have ongoing diagnosed psychiatric conditions. 5 had physical health problems, and 4 didn't have any psychiatric or physical health problems at all. We used the NEO-PI to assess personality, and this is a rather long questionnaire that looks at personality in 5 different domains: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And together, this is known as OCEAN, or the Big 5. And we also measured the degree to which participants perceive themselves to have undergone a mystical experience. And this looks at things such as connectedness to nature, oceanic boundlessness, feeling connected to God. So we found that there was significant decreases in how neurotic participants were. And this was when we compared it to our comparison group, which was individuals that were traveling around South America, not drinking ayahuasca. What's more, these decreases in neuroticism weren't only in the short term, so immediately after the 2-week retreat, but they were maintained 6 months later. And we found that particularly exciting. We also found there was significant increases in how agreeable participants were in comparison to the control group. This was both in the short term and the long term as well. We also found that the greater the degree of reduction in neuroticism, the greater the perceived mystical experience of the participants. So put simply, the more participants thought they'd undergone a peak or a mystical experience, the less neurotic they became. So this is a study that we're just about to publish now. We were looking at the impact of ayahuasca on trauma-related conditions. I'd just like to say thank you to the Medical Research Council for funding this one, and also to Celia Morgan for supervising us. So in this study, we were looking at the short and the long-term impact of ayahuasca on mental health and well-being for those who had experienced varying degrees of childhood trauma. We also wanted to see how the changes in mental health outcomes were related to overgeneralized autobiographical memories. Overgeneralized autobiographical memories have been associated with depression, so we wanted to see how those had changed. And we also, again, wanted to look at the role that mystical experience had in mental health outcomes. And so here we had 65 participants, and we collected quantitative data as well as qualitative, and so semi-structured interviews. And we can see on this side of the slide the measures that we used. So again, we have measures looking at anxiety, depression, childhood trauma, self-compassion, and also autobiographical memory recall. In addition, in this study, we collected saliva samples before and after the retreats, and we were looking at any epigenetic changes that occurred. So this is the way in which DNA is expressed, and specifically we're specifically hoping that would show us something about trauma and the way that ayahuasca can have a real physical impact on participants as well as a psychological impact. We found significant decreases in depression, both in the short term, so immediately after the retreats, and 6 months later in the long term. And again, we found significant decreases in the short and long term in anxiety. We found that participants' self-compassion increased, so they became more self-compassionate immediately afterwards, and this continued to increase at 6-month follow-up. Participants became less distressed, and again, this was maintained at the long-term follow-up as well as in the short term. And we also found that participants had less overgeneralized negative autobiographical memory recall. And this was expected because we were expecting to see decreases in depression. We were quite surprised that, unlike our previous research and other research that's out there, we didn't find any correlation between the degree of mystical experience and the changes in depression and anxiety. And we also were even more surprised to find that we didn't find any correlation between the degree of childhood trauma and the impact that ayahuasca had. But this could very well be due to the scale that we used. The childhood trauma questionnaire looked at quite significant single traumas like physical or sexual abuse. And it may well be because we're largely using non-clinical populations that some of the everyday traumas that are more common were missed with this scale. And that's why it wasn't reflected in the results. A quick word about the epigenetics. So we found a significant change in the sigma-1 gene and the way that it was methylated. I would like to point out, though, that this was a very small sample for epigenetics, and we normally need at least in the hundreds before we can start to generalize any results and have any meaningful results. It does, however, suggest that ayahuasca might be having some kind of impact on the way that DNA is expressed, specifically in relation to trauma, as this gene has been associated with trauma. So it's an exciting area that we're actually exploring in our latest study, which we've just started and abruptly stopped doing data collection for because of COVID, but hopefully that will restart again soon. A few limitations with these kinds of studies. So we've had limited access to equipment because we are in the center of the Amazon. There's also no set doses of ayahuasca in the studies. Some might see this as a limitation of study design. However, because this is observational, it does make sense because it's down to the shaman, the curandero, to use their intuition and to decide how much ayahuasca each participant gets. So in some ways, it does fit with the observational design. We have ayahuasca samples that we're looking to analyze to look at the levels of DMT and MOAIs. However, because of COVID, these have been put on the back shelf, so we're still waiting for that data to come out. So we're not entirely sure what was in the ayahuasca samples as of yet. We couldn't control variables from the short term to the long term. So some participants at 6-month follow-up had started engaging in things like yoga or meditation when they weren't before. And some of them had even drunk ayahuasca again. So we need to bear that in mind too. There's definitely a self-selection bias. There's a certain kind of person who flies out to the Amazon in order to partake in ayahuasca ceremonies. And this can be due to money or due to time off, as well as due to personality factors as well. So we need to bear that in mind. I'd just like to finish off with this question. Is ayahuasca research ethical? And I think it's important that we keep considering this when we're doing this work and really checking ourselves. We can't deny that data is required. There are more people using ayahuasca than ever before, flying out to the Amazon and also partaking in ayahuasca retreats around the world. And it's important that we know what is going on with those people. There's also been a stagnation in treatments in mental health. Since the turn of the millennium, there's been pretty much, next to no really new treatments coming out, only, modified versions of old treatments. And so maybe ayahuasca could help to give some influence in new treatments. There is, however, risks of medicalizing ayahuasca. I'm sure that most people would agree that we wouldn't want to see ayahuasca in the hands of big pharma. There are anecdotal claims of people having amazing healing and also some harm all over the media. And it's important to research that and to see if there's any truth there. Is this just cultural or spiritual appropriation? Is it that Westerners have taken indigenous people's land and resources and now we're moving on to the immaterial? There's also issues with understanding what's going on from a Western framework and oversimplification. And I'd just like to mention reciprocity. So reciprocity is the idea of giving things back. So we need to make sure that there is, as much as possible, at least some kind of exchange and work towards potentially a more fair exchange when it comes to using plant medicines and indigenous knowledge. These are some websites of some really great organizations who are working towards making reciprocity a reality. Great, so thank you very much, and looking forward to getting into a discussion. And please feel free to email me if you have any specific questions.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Simon. What a great presentation. What a great start. So I was just going to say to people, there's loads to talk about there, isn't there? So do post your questions. And when we've listened to Roz, then we'll start the discussion. I have, quite a lot. It's really a lot to think about. How privileged are we to get an expert in, a medicine like this in a naturalistic setting? And Simon spent quite a lot of time with the Shipibo, and that's very, very special. Okay, so thank you very much, Simon. So now I'll introduce you to Roz Watts now, who's a complete expert in this and was there at the very beginning in the Imperial trials. So Roz is a clinical psychologist, and she was the clinical lead for the psilocybin in depression study, the first one at Imperial. So really, she was there at the very beginning, folks, of our UK psychedelic renaissance. So she led this clinical team. And actually, I'm reading David Nutt's autobiography at the moment. That's a great read, folks. But he says that lots of this work was done on top of, the workload, and lots of work at the weekends and evenings. So this was a huge achievement. And this trial facilitated over 100 psilocybin treatment sessions in just over a year. I mean, this is such a lot of work and such a commitment to helping people. Really groundbreaking. So Roz was at Imperial for 5 years. She published her work on, her focus really is the psychological mechanisms of psilocybin treatment. And her model of psychedelic therapy, accept, connect, embody, ACE for short. She has moved on from Imperial, on and up, and she's now clinical director for the Synthesis Institute. And there she is expanding the ACE model by supplementing psychedelic therapy with a year-long therapy program. Accept, connect, embody, and restore. So this is now the ACER model. So this program is designed to support ongoing connectedness to self, to others, to the natural world. That's most important, I think. And she has developed a validated psychometric tool. So that's no mean feat, folks, for measuring connectedness. She's committed to building structures to safeguard, as Simon has already touched on, the ethical expansion of psychedelic therapy. And that's something we all need to think carefully about. She also sits on the USONA Clinical Advisory Board, and she will be involved in training programs. That's something else that comes up a lot. Many people wanting to train to be psychedelic therapists. And those will be offered both by Synthesis and Usona. So actually, Rods, keep us posted about that, because there are many people who are always asking for information about that. Okay, once again, folks, I will stop talking and hand you over to the expert.
Thank you, Jo. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming. And Simon, thank you so much for that presentation. Yeah, really, really interesting, and really good to see the focus on the ethical aspects, which is often, yeah, it hasn't been, I guess, as present in the forefront as maybe it could have been. And hopefully we're going to redress that balance now. So it just reminded me, actually, Simon, seeing your presentation, there's a film that's just been made by Rebel Wisdom. They make films about kind of current topical issues, and they've just made a film about psychedelic capitalism. So you can see it find it online. I think it's just called Psychedelic Capitalism, but it gives a really good background to well, yeah, the kind of the huge sudden interest, well, not so sudden, but the huge interest from the mainstream in the kind of well, the possibility of profit, huge profit from these kind of medicines. So yeah, it's a really important issue, and it's often kind of left to the end. So Simon, I liked it that you had it right at the very beginning, like, you know, this is kind of the first thing for us to think about. So yeah, I was at Imperial for a number of really, you know, incredibly well, I was very, very lucky to find myself there. It was really just one of those lucky moments of just, I was on maternity leave at the time when they were looking for a psychologist, and I suddenly had a bit of time on my hand to volunteer somewhere, and kind of sent an email, and they said, oh, we were just looking for someone, why don't you kind of pop in? So it was really, I was very lucky, and found myself in this wonderful world of, yeah, sitting with people in a room, people with depression, having 2 psilocybin sessions with synthetic psilocybin, with psychologists in the room. And this world opened up, because I'd been working as a clinical psychologist in the NHS, and Simon and I were talking earlier about, you know, the frustration sometimes, because there's not so much innovation in mental health right now. In mainstream mental health, there aren't very many new kinds of treatments, but it was really incredible to suddenly be working in this totally new way, and in a way, a very ancient way, which was about just being with somebody all day long. Because in conventional psychology, psychiatry, you spend, you know, in psychiatry probably only, you know, really not that long with people, but in psychology, you kind of, the maximum really is like an hour a week, 50 minutes a week, and you really don't get to really kind of go that deep there. And even when you can go that deep, often you're a bit lost, struggling with what to do with it, because people have told their stories so many times. But with psilocybin, for people with depression, which is the population I've been always working with psilocybin, it allows people to go to deeper layers. It allows people to go beyond their story that they've been telling to many therapists and telling many times, and it allows them to go to a deeper layer of themselves. And really, the mechanism that I've been looking into, as Jo mentioned, is all about connectedness. So depression is a state of profound disconnection from the self, disconnection from other people, disconnection from the wider world, disconnection from the beyond as well. People feel very trapped. They feel like they're living in their mind. They're living in a kind of prison, and it's very hard to break out of that. And no amount of, you know, CBT, which might, like cognitive behavioral therapy, in which might say, you know, you should go out, you should try this, you should challenge those thoughts, you're not disconnected, you know, it often for people offers a temporary solution, but really doesn't fundamentally shift. It's so interesting seeing Simon's talk about this epigenetic aspect, like, and you mentioned as well, Simon, about like the embodied change, that it's not just about, there's a physical embodied change that happens that you see with people. So it's not just it's not just changing the story or changing the thoughts, it's an embodied physical change. So yeah, people with depression, they would come into our clinic at Imperial, and they would sit with us all day listening to a playlist. Very important part of it, as you mentioned, Jo, the music really is the kind of third therapist in the room. The psilocybin allows people to open up and access all these different parts of themselves and have these journeys really of exploration. And those journeys are shaped by the music. The music it's like a kind of handrail. It takes people in particular directions. but the content of those journeys is very much given life, is given color by people's own unconscious mind, what they've stored, childhood memories, and beyond. You know, they're so rich, these experiences, and they would just have these experiences themselves, and we would sit with them. And in the first study, we did a kind of a little bit of psychological support, so preparing people for the experience. But in the second study, which was the larger study, which we just finished, which was, we compared psilocybin to an antidepressant. In that larger study, we had a therapy model. So that was the ACE model that you referred to, Joe, accept, connect, embody. And it really is kind of mainly about this principle of connection. So it was helping people, give people the tools to really connect to their bodies before the experience, because that, I think, in the preparation phase is the key thing, especially for us Westerners. We might, you know, it's maybe with stronger egos, a stronger sense of individualism, a stronger sense of who we are, a stronger sense of kind of resistance and not wanting to let go, and, you know, helping people come back to their bodies. People were, one of the things about disconnection is that because you're in your head, you're disconnected from your body. And that really, especially when people have had trauma, physical trauma, sexual trauma, that disconnection from the body is even stronger. So people really need, I guess, kind of training in how to connect to their body. And that's as simple as focus on your heart. What do you feel? What does your heart feel like? Focus on your stomach. What do you feel in your stomach? You know, focus on your left foot, like bringing people's attention to their body. So we would do these visualization exercises for the preparation, which was all about helping people connect to the physical representation of emotions in their body. So, you know, asking them to feel a sense of sadness. Where do you feel that sadness in your body? What does it feel like? Is it getting bigger? Like really being curious about those physical sensations. And then they would have the psilocybin experience itself. And then afterwards, we would use a kind of a map in a way for helping people develop these processes of connecting to the self, connecting to others, and connecting to the wider world. And the metaphor that I used in the ACE model was of a deep sea dive. So because we don't really have, I mean, where Simon's been working, there is this long standing tradition and framework, a way of understanding these medicines, a cultural community around it. There's a whole container, which is amazing. And we don't really have it, because there would have been medicine traditions, especially in the Celtic tradition. We you know, there would have been mushroom eating communities in the UK and Europe, but that legacy has largely been lost. So we don't really have a framework to draw from, our own kind of indigenous medicine framework. So in a way, we're kind of having to create one, because we need a framework. So there are lots of different frameworks. There's the kind of medical lens, and there are also some more ways of integrating that with more kind of spiritual frameworks as well. But in the framework I was developing was very much a kind of psychology one. I'm a psychologist, so it was very much based on principles of psychological flexibility, essentially, which is what psychedelics seem to do. They really bring about this sense of psychological flexibility, which is similar to connectedness, which is also similar to Simon's personality work, kind of similar to the personality trait of openness as well. So the model of the deep sea dive was because people, you know, you say to someone with depression who's never had a psychedelic experience, so, you know, tomorrow you're going to be having psilocybin. They have no reference for that. They don't know what that's going to mean. So we would kind of tell them a story of, imagine it's like a deep sea dive. Imagine you're swimming along the surface of the sea, and, you know, your normal thoughts are kind of hitting you like persistent waves, and you're trapped in that, you know, just struggling to stay afloat and to tread water. And that's kind of depression. And then you're choosing to take these capsules of synthetic psilocybin, and you're going to dive down beneath the surface of that kind of normal thinking, which is kind of like the ego mind, or like day-to-day consciousness. You're going to dive down into your body, and you're going to dive down. And when you get down to those layers, there's lots of murky waters, there's lots of dark places, because that's why you're here. And when you dive down to those layers of the sea, don't swim away from them and look for the pretty fish and the bright lights. Go down and down into the darkest places that you can, because that's where you'll learn. And we use the analogy of like a spiky oyster shell. So right at the bottom of the sea, where it's really dark and muddy, you see these spiky looking oyster shells, and you don't really want to go near them because they're very ugly and spiky and dark. And inside them, when you open them up, if you go towards them, they've got all these layers of slime. And that's kind of like the shame and the feeling of vulnerability that can happen when you do go towards your deepest pains and the things that you've been really trying to hide from yourself for a long time, because they're just so threatening. And you open up that spiky shell, you go through those layers of slime, shame, and then you get to the pearl. And the pearl and the oyster is the learning that comes when we go in that ugly place, is when we go towards it rather than away. And it's so hard to do. It's hard to do in our daily lives. It's hard to do on our own. You really need a community of people supporting you. But psilocybin really seems to help people go to that place. And with their guides, with the maybe holding the hand of, maybe us holding their hand, and the music helping them through, maybe some quite mournful music to help them open up to those feelings, they would often have these big moments of breakthroughs, of understanding why that pain was there, understanding what that pain was trying to teach them. And then the analogy in the kind of pearl dive story is, when you have the pearl, then you can swim up to the surface of the sea, and then you have a different perspective on your life, because you can kind of see things again. You're not trapped on that surface of the sea treading water. You can swim up and take a breath, and you've got this pearl of learning that you have. What we found in the study, in both studies, is that people's depression really seems to kind of pretty much go for a few months. And so, that pearl seems to be quite long lasting. People describe this sense of connectedness, like that feeling of coming up through the surface of the sea and having the big sky and the sun setting. They describe that feeling of connectedness for a few months, but then it does tend to fade. Or it did in all the people in the two studies that I worked in. For a very small number of people, it lasted for a long period of time. I think in the first study we did, 20 people had psilocybin, and of them, 11 described their depression kind of going for about 3 months and feeling very connected for about the same amount of time. 3 of them didn't have any effect at all, and that's something I'd love to talk to Simon about, is the kind of no response. I think there's a particular name for it in I think it's the NIDO or something, but I'm going to ask Simon about that. The NADA experience, I think, maybe. But yeah, 3 people didn't have any experience at all, unfortunately. And then 6 people had this longer term, maybe 6 months plus sense of remission from depression. But I don't think it ever lasted longer than a year for those people that had it for more than 6 months. So yeah, I mean, there's so much to say. That's a kind of introduction to the studies at Imperial. I'll just say a very quick thing, and we can talk more about it. But yeah, I'm now working at a Synthesis Institute to develop group models. So rather than looking at individuals having psilocybin for depression, we're building a therapeutic program for groups of people with depression to have psilocybin therapy together. And I think that's because of this connectedness aspect, that what I really learned, my biggest learning from the Imperial trials was that because we don't have the cultural container, and we don't have the stories and the myths, and we don't have the organizations and for this kind of work, that after people had these experiences, they had these big openings, they dived in the sea, they had their oysters, and then their depression came back, and they didn't have anywhere to go to connect with other people. Their doctor, if they went to speak to their doctor and said, my depression's back, I did a psychedelic study, and the doctor would usually say, well, what on earth did you do that for? Family members still, a bit suspicious. And the world that we're in is in the UK is still, things are changing, but people really were lost without their tribe. They'd had this little glimpse of another world, and they felt a bit lost without it. So what the program at Synthesis is all about connectedness, and that's connectedness to self, connectedness to others, connectedness to nature. It's a huge part of the program we're building, and a sense of being part of a kind of interconnected web. So that people, when they go through psychedelic therapy, they don't just have this one-off experience and then they go back to their normal life. But when they have the experience, it's kind of like we're saying, okay, hello, welcome, you've walked through a door, and you don't ever have to leave now, because you're part of a community of professionals, of the health workers, of other people with depression, and the people at Synthesis, and researchers. We're doing research too. You're joining a community, and it's about connectedness. And the kind of emblem for it really is, I'm not using the pearl diving analogy now, because it's a group model. So the pearl dive analogy was great for an individual kind of hero's journey, like a psychedelic experience for an individual. But for the group work, I'm using the analogy of a forest, because trees in a forest, they communicate with each other underground. They're all connected. And what connects all the trees in the forest together is a layer of mycelium, which is mushroom, and the mushrooms connect all the tree roots together, allow them to share resources and speak to each other. So that's really the kind of image I'm working with at the moment, this idea that we're all connected underground, and that we can use that connectedness to help people maintain a sense of openness, inspiration, but also, yeah, connectedness to each other, which I think at this COVID time is something that we're desperately, desperately needing. So yeah, I think that's probably, yeah, enough from me.
Enough for now, Roz.
Enough.
You believe me, there are lots of questions for you both. But I'm just looking at a lovely comment actually, and I'm just thinking the same thing. Lauren says she loves this, Roz, and I have to say, Roz, I could listen to you all day. I just the diving analogy, I love that. It's fantastic. Actually, confession, people, I've two daughters, and one is really into foraging. So I've started foraging for mushrooms. Anyway, you know, we have to hope I don't poison myself, poison the family. But she's all about the mycelium, and you know, when you're talking about the trees, and then of course the mushrooms grow. Quite a lot of them grow on trees, and it is anyway. It's marvelous. Okay, so yeah, so the connection, and connection with nature and to other people, and the community. So I think that's so sad that you know, people have this amazing experience, they heal, and then it gets lost. So that was individual therapy in the trials. Do you have a sense that groups, I mean, also thinking about the economics of it, I guess the group therapy will be more, you know, more viable and maybe more valuable, do you think, for some people?
Well, I mean, that's the way it's been done. So in the cultures that have been using psychedelic plants, psychedelic medicines for thousands of years, it is done in groups. So I guess in Simon's ayahuasca field study, it's always done in groups. And I think the healing power of the group is huge, because there is this dynamic I noticed with, we actually connected when COVID happened. Our study finished slightly prematurely, which meant that some of the people that had their psychedelic experiences right towards the end, they didn't have their integration sessions in the clinic because we couldn't go into the lab. So I started an online integration group for them to meet each other. So we started this Zoom group for the participants in the study, and it just, meeting each other, knowing that they'd all been through the same experience, the bonds that developed, the strength that came from that is probably almost as strong as the psilocybin experience itself. Honestly, like, people were really crying out for that kind of community, and it's a community of people that are all really committed to doing the same thing. It's not just it's not just some friends chatting. It's people saying, we have all suffered for decades, we're really committed to finding a new way through this, and we're going to help each other. And so it's a very moving, powerful connection. And I think it's probably different in kind of ayahuasca ceremonies, because then I guess you either have like tourists together, or you might have like whole communities having drinking medicine together. But there is something from that communitas, from that communal connection, that I think you can't really find in an individual session. I'd love to know what Simon thinks though.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think you know, sometimes with ayahuasca ceremonies, they can be done one-on-one. But as you say, I think there's such benefit in, you know, it's really important psychotherapy is really important with psychedelics for sure. But the conversations that people have on the retreats with each other quite often are you know, they're kind of bordering on psychotherapy in their own way, you know, and they're not just chit chat. You're delving to those dark places, to those deep places, and that's really been reflected in a lot of the qualitative studies that we've done, where people are talking about their experiences. Having someone that you can talk to and say, I'm experiencing this, and someone else who either says, I get it, or like, me too, and it's different to therapy, where the therapist, you know, for most parts of therapy, doesn't give away much about themselves. It's a different kind of support, both of which I think are vital.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. For all our therapies, I suppose. So I have a question for you, Roz, from Jenny, about the preparation stage for this treatment. So I guess she has quite a lot of experience in psychotherapy. She says it can take a long time for trust to develop in a therapy when you have a new client, especially if they've been abused or through some sort of trauma. I guess this is a question for both of you, actually. She's wondering how you manage to do this with your clients, your patients, in just a couple of sessions before the psilocybin treatment. It's tough one, actually.
Really so important, so important. And yeah, it's something I should actually always include whenever I talk about this, because it kind of needs to be there as a kind of prerequisite, that the screening process we went through was so incredibly long and complex. We had thousands of people on our waiting list at Imperial, and we really we were looking for something so specific, really. And we had, I don't know, however many, from thousands of people down to 60. And in a way, what we were, people had severe depression, but we were also very honest with people and said, look, this is an extremely intense experience. Firstly, the fact that they even applied to do it shows, again, it's the kind of self-selection bias, like people in, that will fly to the Amazon. There's already a degree of openness and kind of courage to apply for something like that. I mean, these experiences can be some of the most terrifying experiences of your life. Some of my ayahuasca experiences I would put down as my very most terrifying experiences I've ever had. So, you really have to let people know that they might feel like they are dying, they're exploding, all the world suffering on their shoulders for 8 hours. It can really be like that. So for people to come through and be willing to face their traumatic experiences and all that kind of pain, already that the people were applying to us were very, very kind of ready for this. And then we had these long interviews with people, and those interviews were really about how we felt the rapport would be. So we would have the psychiatrist and the guides in the room for the screening interview. And in that interview, it was really a sense of, we are the guides that are going to be in this session. Do we feel that we can comfortably fit with this particular person? Because different therapists will fit easily with different clients, participants, because of all sorts of different factors that we're not even really consciously aware of. But some people, we might just feel like, yeah, I can work with this person, I feel really solid with this person. And some people, we might think something in me is being slightly triggered here, it doesn't feel so comfortable. And it's the same for the participant. They get a sense of whether they trust this guide. So it was really this sense of sitting in a room with someone for a couple of hours, and if we felt that the rapport was just growing naturally after those 2 hours of talking, then we would accept that person. And I think it was kind of, it worked out fine. Like the people that we had that gut sense of, this person is going to be able to trust us, they were able to do that. So yeah, 2 sessions to form that trust is very brief, and I think it only works if you have a very careful screening procedure to really specifically screen for ease of rapport building for somebody.
So Simon, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, obviously this is just the beginning, and with these trials that we do at King's and Imperial, we're restricted by time and by money, and obviously it goes without saying, it would be far better if we could see people for therapy for a year beforehand and a year afterwards. That's something that we can work towards, but this is the very beginning, and really just trying to prove safety and efficacy. The more therapy, as always, the better.
And just to jump in very quickly to say that, yeah, the synthesis therapy program, the preparation phase is now 4 or 5 months. So we work with groups of people for about 5 months before they have a psilocybin experience. So it's a kind of year-long program with the psilocybin retreat put just before the middle of the program. So I think probably 4 or 5 months is probably, in a realistic real world population where you're not doing that incredibly careful screening, is probably how long you might need, really, to build that sense of readiness and trust.
But Ross, how do you manage this economically? Because this must be expensive for people to take part in.
So yes, well, I can't really say very much about this, actually, because this is something that's not yet been kind of like publicly announced. But essentially, I'll put a question mark by it because it's not anything that's kind of sure yet. But essentially, we are, because of amazing philanthropic, the thing about psychedelics is that there are some incredible philanthropists out there who are recognizing the situation we are in at this moment in time in history, and the crises that are affecting us, the mental health crisis, the ecological crisis, and how if there was a time to put all hands on deck, anything you can give to this situation, please give. There are people that have donated fortunes to this work for free. So all I can say is, because of that, it's going to be accessible to people. And I think at the first phase it will rest on philanthropy, and then as this develops, hopefully the models will get cheaper to do, because at the moment it's very expensive to set it all up because there's no structures in place. We're having to kind of create all the structures, but in time it will get cheaper and cheaper to run this. We'll have more and more people trained in it. So I think the group model, there's a really amazing model called the pollinator approach, which is by a guy called Bennett Zellner, who's an economist, and he's developed a model for doing psilocybin therapy at scale by communities, for communities, not a big pharma model. And this pollinator approach, I think, really sets out a way that this can be done by the community. We can do this ourselves for each other. So philanthropy will hopefully get us through the first phase, and then community action will hopefully take that and run with it.
That's great news. That's really, and that's the Heroic Hearts model, isn't it? They, you know, that they have a lot of philanthropists providing lots of money.
Yeah,
which is amazing. It's absolutely brilliant. Now somebody, Roz, has asked about the training. Yes, this is Benjamin Davey asking about the Synthesis Conference. So said it was great and how brilliant your training program looks. But again, back to the money, it's quite a lot of, how do we manage that?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things where if we had philanthropists saying, oh, we are open, if somebody wants to come and give us, many millions of pounds to support that, we would love that. But essentially these things just cost so much to do. So we do have scholarship places at Synthesis. So I think of the people coming on for the practitioner training, there is a good chunk of people that will have it for free or at low cost, but we're trying to make sure that those scholarship places go for people that would otherwise not be able to access this work and have come from underprivileged backgrounds. For example, we really want to make sure that we have some Black, Indigenous, people of colour that get those scholarships. So we are thinking about that, but it's just a case of balancing the books, because we need to pay all of the team and pay the rent on the venue and all that kind of stuff. So it's it ends up being pretty expensive.
No, that's all really, really encouraging, isn't it? It's such good news. It really is all happening. So there's an age-old question here from Maeve about blinding the studies in the trials, I guess. Simon, this is probably a question for you both, actually. You'll both have thought about this.
I think one thing to point out is that there has actually been one placebo-controlled ayahuasca trial, which was done in Brazil, where I don't know how they got ethics for this, but they made a thick black tarry liquid that just made you vomit and had no psychotropic properties. I know, and gave it to half their participants. And amazingly, 2 of them thought they had drunk ayahuasca, but there was a lot of confounding variables because these participants were taken from quite poor areas in Brazil, and they were put up in the hospital, and so maybe there was some bias there. But it normally becomes quite apparent, in my experience, within the first half an hour or so, whether or not the participant has an active dose. I mean, quite often we use an active placebo, so a very small dose of the psychedelic to try and help the blinding. But there are also lots of cases like the ayahuasca case that we just gave, and on the trials at King's, where we don't know, where the jury's out, and then when the unblinding does occur after the trial, sometimes it is a bit surprising. But it is an ongoing issue with the blinding in psychedelics, for sure.
It is really interesting. Was there one trial where they compared immediate treatment to having to wait for 6 weeks? I thought, and that was sort of thinking of the expectation. It's not really blinding. Roz?
I haven't heard of that study you're referring to, but in terms of the blinding, I was fascinated by how often I got it wrong. I was amazed in our study. Simon says sometimes you get some surprises. I often got it wrong. I mean, because of course, you're supposed to not be trying to work out, which it is, but you, in your head, of course, you're trying to kind of you're wondering. And I would say probably about half the time, it was the other way around. We actually gave our participants instead of a placebo, well, the placebo was a very, very small dose of psilocybin. It was 1 milligram versus 25 milligram in the high dose. And actually that 1 milligram was a microdose. And actually people felt the effects of it. And so they felt tingles, sometimes they had a few visuals, and with the music and the setting and everything else, the preparation, people in the 1 milligram sessions had psilocybin experiences. So we were surprised by that. And I think that's why I so often was confused, because many of the 1 milligram people had really quite intense adventures. And sometimes, oh yeah, the nada experience, sometimes people in the high dose group felt nothing at all. And that happened. So Simon, have you seen that either with ayahuasca or in your psilocybin research?
Yeah. I mean, I've seen it in both. I think it's interesting to think about. I'll focus on the ayahuasca stuff to get the contrast. But yeah, from a Western psychological point of view, people might question whether or not that person was ready for the experience, whether or not they were resisting, perhaps whether or not, I don't know, whether they're less prone physiologically to experience the effects of DMT. I know that the Shipibo population, the curanderos, would say that ayahuasca didn't want to work with them. That they would say that the spirit of ayahuasca, wasn't interacting with them very much like the therapeutic relationship. That if we think about that in a more Western way, is it the medicine for you? And this is one quite interesting thing to do with psychedelics. Is I'd be interested to see whether or not different personality types have better responses working with either psilocybin or ayahuasca, or maybe even MDMA or ketamine, to see maybe which conditions or personalities are treated most effectively.
Right, I'm just looking at a couple of questions for both of you from Lewis, is it Paul Freeman? So a question for you, Ros, will the next stage of development, for the Imperial Center, actually you might not know, come when psilocybin is considered a regulated medicine? Will the next stage of development size of I guess the Imperial Center will expand massively then. I think that's what the question is about.
Well, yes, I mean, the Imperial, it's a research centre, so in some ways the Imperial Centre is much less affected by those kind of regulations than other places. So research centres are very lucky to be able to do this work because they have a Home Office licence. So in a way, Imperial's research is kind of unimpeded by the legal status. Whereas what will really happen when it's a licensed treatment, we will see loads of clinics popping up, like providers popping up that we weren't able to use it before. So at Synthesis, we're based in the Netherlands, where psilocybin is legal in the form of truffles. So yeah, there are either centres that are the only people that can really do this work at the moment are places where it's legal, or research places with a Home Office license. But when it's licensed, there will be this. I mean, in America, we're already seeing it's being legalized in various states, and there's just this absolute, flourishing of many different types of offerings. So yeah, we'll see that happen here too.
So I have a question from Iram, who's I'm working with Iram actually. She's one of Drug Science's interns. Does social connectedness and the support that you get from a therapist or community members, does that contribute to the psychedelic experience, to it being more positive or more intense?
I think we're both nodding at that one. Yes.
Yeah. That's a
Simon, how does it play out in terms of like before, because I'm thinking of like the preparation. So before ayahuasca experiences, what's the social connectedness? How do people go into the experience, and how does the social connectedness develop for people when they come together for ayahuasca ceremonies?
Yeah, I mean, I think the social connectedness is really important. We touched on it a bit earlier, having that community of people to go back to, especially after the experience. And I think this is one of the big issues that we see with the ayahuasca retreats, is that quite often people might just turn up for these retreats by themselves and not having that support, not having people who fully understand what's happening. And then certainly when they're in the retreat, there's an increase in the kind of in how connected they are to other people and being able to talk to people. But then I've seen this quite a few times, that they get spat out the other side, and they go and they fly back from the Amazon to New York, where they work in a bank, and they go back to there on like Monday or something. And then and then trying to process what happened can be really, really difficult. And I think it can even be detrimental, because if you're feeling incredibly vulnerable, and you probably will do for a while after the session as well, when all of this stuff's come out, just like psychotherapy, if you then talk to your friends and they kind of either don't get it, or worse, suggest that what happened wasn't real, even though it was real to you, or that you're insane for doing this kind of stuff, then it can be really, really detrimental. So I think that this kind of leads us into regulation as well. At the moment, ayahuasca is largely unregulated throughout most of the world. And as Roz says, we're beginning to see, we will start to see more and more psychedelic clinics popping up everywhere as the trials continue and as the drug regulations change. And I think that will probably be really beneficial, because these communities will be able to form that aren't underground anymore, that people have more access to, and I think that's how social connectedness will have a major positive impact on the psychological outcomes that we see.
So I'm aware that Simon might have to go to his patients. So I have a couple of questions for you, Simon. So ayahuasca, do you think it should ever really be used as a medicine in the West? Or do you think it should remain in traditional settings?
I mean, this is a really, really complex question. And I think, I don't just have one opinion that stays static. It changes the more that the research changes, the more that the world changes. What I do think at the moment is that whatever we do, we need to make sure that there's reciprocity, and that we're using ayahuasca with respect. I think it's also important to look at the facts and whether or not you agree with ayahuasca spreading to the West, or whether or not you agree with people using retreat centers. I mean, that is happening. That definitely is happening. And so that decision has almost been made for us. And I do understand that through the research that I'm doing, even though I'm trying to be objective as a middle-class white doctor from London, I do definitely represent, I represent something. So I'm aware of that. But I think that we could ethically and responsibly set up ayahuasca retreat centers outside of the Peruvian Amazon, very much in a similar way to something like acupuncture. So acupuncture isn't recommended on the NHS, but and it's used as an alternative medicine, but there is its own regulatory board, and it's done with respect. And I think that as plant medicines continue to be decriminalized around the world, we'll probably see something like that popping up for ayahuasca, which I don't think it's going to be perfect, and I think there are going to be a lot of issues with it for sure. But I think that we can do our best to treat the medicine with respect and give back to the indigenous populations as well.
Yeah. We have to find a way, don't we?
Yeah, for sure.
Because there's clearly a lot of commercialization going on, it's like with medical cannabis, and and as you say, the decision's kind of been taken for us. But we have to have the ethics in mind always.
Yeah.
So I really love your slides, Simon, in that the backdrop is the ayahuasca vine.
Yeah.
Right? Well, I'm not going to try and pronounce that. Can you grow it in the West?
I'm sure you could if you had greenhouses. I'm not aware of anyone growing it in the West. And if I was, I wouldn't mention it here. But I know that you can. It's interesting with the ayahuasca vine, because there's research going on into ayahuasca that I'm involved in Australia, for example, and they're using things that are similar to the chacruna leaves, which is in ayahuasca, but isn't actually the Peruvian chacruna leaves. It's a similar DMT containing leaf. And so even though you might not have the exact same, Banisteriopsis caapi and Psychotria viridis, it is possible to make similar things to ayahuasca that are native to different areas and different countries, and that's really interesting to think about, because there are similarities. Is the tradition the same? Would the curanderos disagree with that? I'm not sure. Maybe a whole new tradition could form around it. But that's something interesting to consider as well.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And the whole thing about the purging, is that's an essential part of it? Is everybody sick?
Not everybody. The vast majority are. And it's important as well to remember, a lot of people think of purging as just either vomiting or, indeed diarrhea. But the shamans would consider purging to be a release of energy, And so they would describe, so in a Western way of describing it, we would say that the purging happens because of the beta carbolines that irritate the stomach lining and it causes vomiting. The shamans would say, that may be true, but you're kind of missing the point. The reason the purging happens is to get rid of the impurities in the body. And that could be if you have a bad diet, or if you take lots of recreational drugs, or it could be emotion. So many people, when they drink ayahuasca, will start crying, or laughing uncontrollably. They might be shaking, they might be sweating, yawning is another thing. And these are all seen as ways shamanically of releasing this energy. I'm interested to see what Ros thinks as well about, because it takes you back into the body again, of kind of energy release, and maybe ties in with other forms of therapy, maybe on drama therapy and things like that.
Yeah, I think in a way, well, so with psilocybin, you don't get purging in the same way, but in a way, and I think probably many of our participants were very glad of that, because they may not have wanted to participate if we were using something that might make them really sick. But I think, and it's certainly not something you kind of look forward to, but there is something about the purging that does feel really, really important. And that because of exactly what you say, Simon, the embodied nature of it, and because people are often so in their heads, and problems seem to kind of spin around up here, but there's something about purging that really just takes people out of that for a while, and really, really provides a sense of relief and letting go. I think psychedelics are really all about letting go. That's what the experience of a psychedelic it's about letting go of the ego, letting go of our fixed ideas, letting go of resistance. And there's something about vomiting or purging, which is really the physical representation of letting go. So I think it's a really important part of it, and that people start to kind of welcome it in a way, because it's not often in life you have experiences where you can have that physical letting go that kind of happens through you. It's not something you can kind of consciously decide to do, like, oh, and I'm going to be sick now. It's like the medicine just comes through you, and it speaks through you, and you just have to let go and surrender. There's nothing else to do, and it's kind of a good lesson in that way.
And if you are unwell, it's such a relief to be sick, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sorry, Simon.
Oh, no, I was just going to say the second thing what Ros says, there's something quite symbolic as well, I think, if you're going around in circles in your head in a psilocybin or mainly an ayahuasca experience, and about a certain topic, maybe about, I don't know, a childhood experience, and then there's a huge release of something afterwards. There is this, your brain isn't going around in circles anymore, and you do feel like, oh, did I just vomit out my trauma? Like, is it out of me now somewhere? There's something very kind of physical about it.
Yeah. And also connecting in the community setting as well, because there really is nothing that brings people together like all seeing each other vomiting. So a group of people in the room, and everyone's got a bucket in front of them, and you feel that you're just getting to know the person next to you, but then you hear them really releasing their innermost, their guts are coming out, and you might be doing the same thing, and it really does break those kind of, it helps people bond. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it certainly breaks down a lot of, absolutely. I have a lovely question here from Eddie Jacobs. Eddie Talks Drugs. Are there ways in which you see patients' attachment styles change after the psychedelic experience? So he suggests that there will be, or you'd expect there to be, but he hasn't seen much in the literature on this.
Yeah, I think, I mean, as far as I'm aware, Ros, do correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if there's anything that's been done specifically looking at attachment styles yet, but I do agree that would be fascinating to look at. But I think that I think you're quite right, Eddie, that we can assume that there will be changes, because a lot of the different attachment styles, if they're not secure attachment, are supposed to be associated with what they're called neurotic attachment styles, anxious attachment styles. And if we're seeing changes in neuroticism in patients, I think that there's our participants, there's enough to make, to hypothesize that we would see a change. But I haven't seen any studies specifically looking at it. But again, I think that some of that has been reflected in our semi-structured interviews, where when we've spoken to people after their retreats, and especially with romantic relationships, the dynamic has slightly changed. So perhaps that could be due to attachment styles, but I think that we'd have to specifically look at it to really know.
Yeah, I agree, and I think yes, I think in order for I think that part of our work really now is, as well as in increasing the therapy protocols so that they're longer, like we said before, so they're more substantial. The other real part of our kind of the work to do now is about building integration programs that allow the changes that happen to be maintained. So attachment is a very solid, it's a very, it's quite difficult to shift attachment styles. And I think that whereas, yeah, we certainly saw that people's romantic relationships would improve and they'd feel more connected to other people and find it easier to connect with other people and less anxious in those relationships and more secure. I think it tends to fade away after a certain number of months, unless people really make big changes in their life that would allow those kind of patterns to become more and more entrenched. So if somebody had a really eye-opening psilocybin or ayahuasca experience, they saw their relationship to their partner in a different way, they changed that relationship, and then they started having therapy. Then they started having weekly therapy to really look at their patterns of relating and look at how they had their, their roots in their childhood and that kind of thing. Then you could really see over time someone's attachment style changing. But I think that with regular psychedelic experiences, you could see that too. So like if someone was doing one every year or one every 6 months, but I think just one experience on its own, I would be surprised if that was enough to shift an attachment style permanently.
I guess it emphasizes the importance of maintaining what you've learned and having a group connection as well.
Yeah.
Carrying all that on. So as somebody who's not getting any younger, I'm interested in the letting go aspect, having read Michael Pollan's book. So letting go is obviously for everybody pretty difficult, letting go of that sort of control. I like the idea of the purging help with that a bit. In terms of age groups, is that harder as people get older? In your experience of having presumably helped guided young and older people through all this? It's probably a daft question, I don't know.
It's a really good question.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think through people in my head and wonder if there is a kind of a function of age where people had more resistance.
I think in my experience with the ayahuasca research, there's more participants who are younger, and there are less who are older. But the ones who do come who are older have normally been doing it their entire lives and kind of old hands from the 60s or so I'm not sure. I think maybe there's I think maybe there's a self-selection bias from the people that we do have of a certain age who appear for the retreats.
In our study, I'm just thinking through to particular people, we did have quite a number of participants who were in their 40s, 50s, 60s. And I would say that they were absolutely just as able to let go. And I'm just remembering back to some people, really very, again, because they're the people that chose to come, they're the people that chose to have this experience, and they did have really very rich, I mean, in some ways there's more life experience to draw from, and sometimes more of a sense of it mattering more potentially as well. And yeah, I think people had really extraordinary experiences.
Yeah, that's really good. Yes, just thinking back to the Magic Medicine film, which everybody should watch. That's on YouTube, isn't it, Roz? You're in it?
Yeah, it's on. I think it's on YouTube. Yeah.
It is now. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. But one of those chaps is clearly in his 60s, I think.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and in fact, yeah, I think in that study, quite a number of our participants and the second study were in their 60s, and yeah, I mean, he had a very, very powerful, visceral journey, which I think you can see in the film. Yeah.
Oh, it's such a good film. That's really good. Okay, right. Now then, Stephen Epstein has a very current question about what's going on in America in the Capitol this week. So there was a high-profile psychedelic enthusiast in that. I didn't know that, involved in that assault. Does that affect, do you think that'll affect the decriminalization and the mainstreaming of all this?
I'm just reading it now.
Me too. Yes. I'm trying to understand it, actually. I guess you can do that better, Rod. How did the assault?
I mean, I hadn't seen that.
Me neither.
Generally, I think that there is one of the things we haven't really talked about so much. We mentioned briefly before about psychedelic capitalism. That's one of the kind of shadows. Another huge shadow of psychedelic work is the as well as there being lots of very grounded, strong underground traditions and indigenous traditions with strong lineages, there are some other, like Simon referred to, the charlatans. There are lots of people that the mushrooms told them to become a healer, or Mother Ayahuasca told them that they were a healer. There are lots of people that because psychedelics can decrease the ego, but they also seem to be able to strengthen it too. So there's a lot of psychedelic narcissism, and there's lots of people who are interested in the power that psychedelics can bring. So I didn't know about this particular person, but I think we will see, as this becomes more mainstream and more popular, as well as there being lots of stories of healing, there will be more and more stories of abuse and misuse of power. And yeah, I mean, we know that psychedelics have been used in cults before, and they were used by the CIA to, they've been used for lots of nefarious purposes as well. So yeah, they're amplifiers. They can be, they take on the quality of the situation that they're given in. They're amplifiers of a situation. So if they're used in a kind of used for power or for personal gain, then they will do those things.
I think the thing that jumps out for me there is self-declared guru. And I think, as soon as, even if it wasn't psychedelics, I mean, that's never going to be a good thing, is it? No. And I think this is really an argument for regulation as well, because the where we find ourselves at the moment is without regulation. And even to train as a curandero, to train as a shaman in the Peruvian Amazon, you don't get a piece of paper like you do for becoming a psychologist or a doctor in the UK, but it takes, that's a life's work. It's serious business. And I think as Rod says, we're going to run into trouble with more people who have been told by the mushrooms that they have this ability or this power, which may well have happened, but it's also, it's a life's learning to be able to use these things properly.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really
and also because I think we don't have the working with people in a kind of healing capacity, or working with people who are vulnerable or very open. It's not just about the actual way of working. In some ways, being a psychedelic sitter is in some ways quite a simple role. You sit there, you don't actually do very much. But the reason why it's important for there to be some level of training and care taken about who will do that is because you can do a lot of harm it's not necessarily that doing the job is even the most complicated thing, or sometimes it is, and then you need someone who's really well trained with trauma, but sometimes it's quite simple. But there's always the capacity to do immense harm. And so that's why I sometimes think, I think about my training as a clinical psychologist, and I think about, can I even remember much of what I learned as a clinical psychologist now? Not really. I didn't, you have lectures of topics that you may not then go on to work in. But what happens in a clinical psychology training, and the same as becoming a psychiatrist or many other types of health professionals, is that you have lots and lots of people vetting you. As you go through the process, you have, I don't know, 10, 20 other professionals marking you, looking at you, you're constantly assessed. And so if there are people there that for whatever reason, some unresolved shadow in themselves, some need for power, might misuse their situation and might hurt somebody that was vulnerable, they are kind of spotted, and so they can get support and help, or they don't work with those vulnerable populations. But when someone is a self-styled whatever, when someone becomes a shaman, there isn't necessarily any kind of rigorous structure of lots of people looking at them and checking that they're safe. So some shamans that have become shamans through like initiations, through going through their own trauma, are amazing, healing, wonderful people. I know many that are, people that have become a shamanic practitioner through their own trauma and their own growth, and they work very deeply and beautifully. But also some who have called themselves a shaman, no eyes have been on them, no one's regulated them or checked them, and they've done harm. So we need to be incredibly careful.
Absolutely. So yeah, thank you for answering, well, for everything, both of you. So Graham Campbell has put a link to an article by Jules Evans on this that he says is very good. So thank you for that, Graham. That's very helpful. So folks, I think we should probably let Roz and Simon get back to their day now. Just for both of you, is there anything, take-home message, anything else you'd like to say to our audience? Difficult one.
It's a difficult one. I'd like to say thank you all very much for coming, and yeah, please feel free to drop us a line if you want to chat further. Yes,
actually, I have some specific questions about coming to King's to do a master's from Lewis. Lewis, I suggest you contact Simon separately. Great, this has been amazing. Roz, anything you'd like to?
Just to say thank you, and also to Simon, who I know is working incredibly hard at the moment in a very tricky situation. So thank you for making time for this, and yeah, may the force be with you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so lovely. Yes, absolutely. I have had such a great time. Thank you so much. I've learned an awful lot. There are millions of thanks coming in the chat. Everybody's just had such a brilliant time. So huge thanks to you both. Yeah, and we'll probably get you back sometime.
Yeah, love to.
Thanks for having us, Jo.
Many events. So what I'm going to do now, folks, yeah, just keep the thanks coming in, because that's really nice to see, I think. I'm going to do a plug for the Drug Science Women in Psychedelics event, our second one, which is coming up on the 19th of January at 4 p.m. Drug Science website, everybody. The Students Psychedelic Conference that will have many expert speakers, that's 30th, 31st of January. And I'm going to try and share my screen, so just hope that this actually works. For our next, no, can't do that, can I? Very sad. Oops, seem to have turned everything off. Can you see that? So that's our next event, the next Street Drugs event. And what I'm going to do now is hand you over to the boss, James Morgan. Aha, he is there. Happy days. If James will give you a little bit of information about YouTube, how to access this, all that stuff, and maybe some links from the chat. James will be able to help you access those.
Yeah, thanks lots, Joe, and thanks huge amount, Roz and Simon. That was brilliant. I learned loads and loads and loads, and yeah, hope we can continue or at another point. That was really, really, really good. And so yeah, yeah. So our next one is in 2 weeks' time, and so this is on cannabis policy, as Joe showed us on her screen a minute ago. I've put down a link there if you want to go follow the tiny URL Deep Dive Cannabis if you would like to get your tickets for that one. So for the next one, we have 2 speakers. We have Marcos Bodin, who is will be calling from Uruguay. He works for the Uruguayan government, and you may or may not know the situation. They have a legalized system where they've actually got a government monopoly on cannabis. That's how it's supposed to work anyway. They decided they wanted to do away with the ultra-capitalistic nature of drug dealing. So the government has a deal with the producers and sells it. Marcos works for the government to research and evaluate the cannabis situation in Uruguay. So we'll be very privileged to hear lots and lots from Marcos. We also have Dr. Mafalda Pardal. She mainly researches cannabis social clubs. So she's based at the University of Ghent. She's someone that I regularly go to the European social drug research annual conferences. I lost my words then. I forgot the acronym. But anyway, me and Fowler go to the same annual conference. I've heard her present a few times on her area of expertise, which is how the cannabis social club system works. So if you are interested in that, please do come along, and please do keep a lookout on Twitter and on Facebook for more events. We were shortly going to myself, Joe Neal, and Chris Chandler, who is with us as well. We're very soon going to meet up and decide on what will come next. So I think we'll keep on doing something more or less monthly. I guess we'll decide how often we're going to do them when we speak later as well. So I think I'll leave you with that. I've also posted the YouTube channel there. So we've got the 3 existing YouTubes up there, and there will be a 4th one very, very soon when I put this one up shortly. So unless anyone else has anything they would like to say, just thanks again very, very much to Roz and to Simon. And yeah, it's been absolutely excellent. I look forward to seeing you all again on another one of these Zooms, and maybe seeing some of you in real life as well, if the world can get us a little bit back to normal at some point soon.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much all, and have a lovely Friday.
Thank you very much, James. Right, see you next time, folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
James, I'll be back in a minute.
Great. See you in a minute.
All right, James.
All right, that's good. I should probably stop the recording now, shouldn't I? I think.
Yeah, might be a good idea.